The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire is one of the momentous moments in all of world history. As we've talked about in the previous episodes of this series, the story that happens here and the historical events that unfold are really unlike almost any other story in history. And because of that, or maybe as a result of that, the question for centuries after the conquest has always been, how should we think about this event? How did people at the time make sense of this historic conquest? How did those historical narratives change over time, both from the Spanish perspective and the Mexica perspective? And what do those historical narratives tell us about what actually happened here? One of the things that's interesting here is this story really highlights how morality and historical narrative are very closely tied together. So we'll start with the Aztec, and we've discussed the narrative of the Aztec here in this series, that they were superstitious savages, and their use of violence and brutality and human sacrifice demonstrate how they were less civilized than their European counterparts, and that this lack of sophistication is a major reason why they lost and were conquered by a more civilized foe. Again, this was the narrative that was out there historically for hundreds of years, and a large part of more modern scholarship on the Mexica people and the Aztec Empire is dispelling this myth a little bit. As we've outlined here, there were very human reasons for things like human sacrifice, things like exacting tribute from conquered provinces, things that were characteristic of the Aztec Empire like violence and brutality. These realities were not necessarily the result of superstition and a lack of knowledge and a lack of civilization. They were a result of the history of the Mexica people and the political and social and economic realities of what life was like in Mesoamerica and in this area they call the Mexican Basin. And we have to be very careful about how we think about these types of narratives and how morality and the story of history interconnect here. Of course, none of this stuff about the realities of the Aztec Empire is to say that they were moral in any sense. In fact, we argued here that their brutality and the violence that was characteristic of their political system almost certainly came back to bite them at the end, and it cost them allies when they desperately needed them the most at the end when the Spanish arrived. Now, before we go any further here, there is one perspective that says, hey, wait a second here. We need to pump the brakes with this talk of morality and history going together. Because maybe what you're doing is assigning your current values of what's good and what's bad and what's moral, and you're retroactively assigning those values onto the peoples of the past, and that's not a fair thing to do. The problem with that particular perspective is it's not assigning current values to the past because it's looking at how the morality at the time was viewed. Again, we know for a fact that the way the Mexica people would take prisoners of war from surrounding provinces and rip families apart and exact tribute at times that was aggressive and maybe even unpayable, we know that these things upset people at the time. And by the way, to some extent, we know that Aztec leaders justified some of this brutality and human sacrifice by appealing to notions of the greater good and the good of the Altepet, the greater city-state. But anyway, we know that people viewed this as wrong at the time. If you don't think watching someone in your family being captured, tied up, marched to a city hundreds of miles away, and sacrificed on top of a pyramid, if you don't think watching those things happen to a family member would be viewed negatively at the time, then we probably just have different conceptions of what it means to be a human being. And again, this goes back to what we talked about in an earlier episode, where is the past a foreign country, or is the past some sort of alien world that we can't make any sense of at all? So I think that morality is actually at the center of the Aztec story and the story of the Mexica people as a whole. But what about the Spanish view of this conquest, and what about historical views on that Spanish view? Like any colonialist narrative, morality is at its center. And again, this is not some post hoc moral mentality here. Morality mattered at the time period. In this case, from the perspective of the oppressors who justified their actions with Christianity, and the perspective of the oppressed who were victims of this, or sometimes even adopters of Christianity themselves. A lot of this goes back to the very origins of how the Spanish viewed Nahua-speaking people right from the beginning of their first interactions and the subsequent conquest to follow. Historians call this process the civilizing mission. A synonym that you may have heard before is the white man's burden. Often this process is applied to European actions in Africa during the 1800s and early 1900s, but the processes in the Americas are similar, and there's really no reason not to apply some of those same concepts here. The civilizing mission is this concept that Europeans, like the Spanish, didn't view themselves as conquerors and oppressors. They viewed themselves as morally good people who were spreading Christianity and looking for opportunities to bring civilization to what they viewed as savage barbarians who didn't have it. And they were looking for opportunities to save people's souls from eternal damnation by bringing them Christianity. So this is one of the primary justifications for colonialism. And it's also how the Spanish viewed this conquest at the time. Historian Amber Bryan, in her paper Revising the Narrative of the Conquest of Mexico, talks about this process and how Spanish narratives of the civilizing mission evolved over time. She points out a Spanish guy at the time who helped to create what we call the Florentine Codex. This was the history of the Mexica people that was put together by Mexica people in collaboration with Spanish friars like Sahagun after the conquest. So this guy, Friar Sahagun, helps put together the original Florentine Codex with collaboration from Mexica people, but then he revises it back in Spain on his own a few years later. And it's very likely that he felt pressure to make the civilizing mission look better from a religious perspective. In one of the revised books that Sahagun puts out, he paints Cortez in a little bit of a better light. And he tries to paint Cortez as being linked to some of the quote-unquote good work that the friars were doing, converting indigenous people to Christianity. And it's a great example here of history being a living entity. So Sahagun in the present moment is being influenced by his religion and maybe even the politics that are going on in Spain at the time. And that's influencing how he's writing the history. And it also influences how we understand those narratives of what happened here for hundreds of years to come. Historian Amber Bryan takes a look at this process, and in particular, how the histories were written for one particular event, the massacre of the Mexica people during the religious festival. So if we remember from last episode, the Spanish were sort of pent up in this palace while Cortez was off dealing with Narvaez and issues on the east coast of Mexico. And the Aztec are getting increasingly concerned with Moctezuma being held captive. They engage in some of this provocative warlike dancing. And then this guy, Cortez left in charge, Alvarez, eventually orders a massacre. And Amber Bryan compares the recollection of this massacre in the Florentine Codex, which is where Friar Sahagun originally helped contribute to that history, and then she compares that with his later revision of that history. She says, quote, Chapter 20 of both the Florentine Codex and Sahagun's 1585 revision addressed the massacre, though with distinctly different perspectives, whereas the Florentine Codex begins, rather neutrally, quote, At the time that seemed opportune to them, the Spaniards came out from where they had been and took all the gates to the square so that no one could get out, end quote. The 1585 revision opens with this sentence, quote, The greatest evil that one can do to another is to take his life when the victim is in mortal sin. This is what the Spaniards did to the Mexican Indians because they provoked them by being faithless in honoring their idols, end quote. Amber Bryan continues here, saying, According to Sahagun, the Spaniards committed a terrible offense by killing the indigenous people while they were worshiping their idols, but he is equally quick to assert that the Spaniards were provoked into this act. Concerns of faith were an enduring theme in Sahagun's writings and central to his revisions in the 1585 text. End quote. This revision of what happened here at this massacre and what the justifications for the massacre were, first of all, show that history can be a living document and that the perspectives of the current moment often impact how that history is written and ultimately maybe even remembered over time. The revision also indicates how central morality and the civilizing mission are to the Spanish at this time, because, again, they want to seem not like the brutal oppressors that the massacre would depict them as, but rather as people who were bringing Christianity to these people and trying to do the right thing, but simply had no choice but to massacre these people who were living in mortal sin. Historian Amber Bryan later goes on to kind of talk about the general bias and maybe fruitlessness of trying to just hand wave away this massacre by saying that it happened because of religious offense. You can justify reasons for bad actions all you want, but sometimes at the end of the day, the brutality speaks for itself. Listen to Friar Sahagun's account of the massacre right after he does the religious justifications. He says, quote, So great was the bloodshed that rivulets of blood ran through the courtyard like water in a heavy rain. So great was the slime of blood and entrails in the courtyard, and so great was the stench that it was both terrifying and heartrending. Now that nearly all were fallen and dead, the Spaniards went searching for those who had climbed up the temple and those who had hidden among the dead, killing all those they found alive. End quote. Obviously, here we see the inherent contradictions at the heart of the civilizing mission. And we can also strongly suspect that the Spanish were aware of these contradictions. It seems hard to believe that Friar Sahagun wouldn't be aware of those. Oftentimes, people do a thing where they say, hey, the people of the past didn't know any better. And they throw their hands up and they say, hey, what are you going to do? But what's interesting here is that, again, we know this isn't true. And this effort at revision by Friar Sahagun undercuts that argument, because why would you be revising the narrative of this massacre to offer justification for it if you didn't know any better? they wouldn't be rewriting the narrative if they didn't know that it was wrong at the time. In other words, they are rewriting the narrative to try to make it look good, even if it leads to contradictions within the civilizing mission and cognitive dissonance between the Spaniards' behavior, which, based on the description of that massacre, was horrible, and their underlying belief system, Christianity, which they viewed to be good. So, how did they manage this cognitive dissonance in these historical narratives? One answer might be that the Spanish made sense of this cognitive dissonance through what we call the Quetzocoatl narrative. This was the idea that the people living in the Aztec Empire believed that Hernando Cortez was a god. Usually they're referring to the god Quetzalcoatl. And he was returning to Mexico to fulfill a prophecy and take over the empire, and he was welcomed because of this. Remember that Cortez went to great lengths to make it seem like Moctezuma just handed the empire over to him, because that way it wouldn't be a conquest, it would be a rebellion, and he would have legal justification to put it down and conquer the empire. And this Quetzalcoatl narrative of the Mexica viewing Hernando Cortez as a god, first of all, connects to the standard historical narrative that the Aztec were superstitious and they couldn't tell the difference between a mysterious person from across the ocean and one of their gods. But this narrative is also so ubiquitous and something that so many people know about. It's taught in schools. It's actually something I learned many years ago. And the only problem with this narrative is it's a total fabrication. The first mention of any of this Quetzalcoatl stuff is in the 1540s by a Spanish friar. So none of Cortez's writings from the time, remember he's sending back letters to Spain all the time that we still have access to, none of those writings mention anything about him being perceived as a god. No writings whatsoever. So from the Spanish side of things, there's really no evidence from the time period that anybody viewed Hernando Cortez as a god. And really not from the Mexica perspective either. Historian Camila Townsend says, quote, "None of the original Nahua histories written down by the earliest generation of students in the privacy of their own homes had said anything like this. In fact, none of the elements ring true, given what we know about Mexica culture. The Mexica did not believe in people becoming gods, or in gods coming to earth only in one particular year, or in anybody having a preordained right to conquer them. They didn't consider Quetzalcoatl to be their major deity, or originally associate him with an abhorrence of human sacrifice. When we add the fact that we can actually watch the story's birth and evolution in European-authored and European-influenced works, the case for its being a later fabrication seems closed." End quote. Townsend thinks that this whole story may have some roots in the idea that the Mexica did refer to Spanish people as teules. In Nahua language, teule kind of means God, but in this case it has more practical connotations, because in Mexica culture, you were named based on where you came from. And since the Aztec didn't know where the Spanish came from, naming them was a problem. So because the Spanish claimed that they were representatives of their Christian God, again, the civilizing mission here, the name Teule makes sense. But even with that, it's a large jump to go from Teule to Cortez is Quetzalcoatl. We do seem to have some Nahua writings from the 1570s and the 1580s that start to mention the Quetzalcoatl narrative. This is 50 years after the conquest. And it's the first time that we see this Quetzalcoatl story from the Mexica side of things. And what's interesting here is that this Quetzalcoatl narrative, although almost certainly not true in the moment, can help both sides to deal with some of the cognitive dissonance that they experienced as a result of the conquest. Again, for the Spanish, the cognitive dissonance was, how do we make this seem like we're doing the right thing? How do we justify massacres and a war of conquest? So like most cases of colonialism, the idea of the civilizing mission fits nicely. The idea that Europeans view themselves as kind of higher beings or godlike entities who are bringing the wonders of civilization to savage barbarians. Who doesn't want their race to be a god? And if the Mexica view them as Quetzocoatl, one of their gods, all the better for this narrative, right? From the Mexica side, you have cognitive dissonance in the fact that a once dominant and great empire that was oppressing others in the region is now having to deal with being crushed and brutalized themselves. So the Quetzalcoatl narrative might take some of the sting out of being defeated. If you're defeated by a divine-like being or an ancient prophecy that's coming to fruition, then that's a little easier to accept than simply losing a war. Hopefully, we can start to see here that very human things like morality and the psychology of cognitive dissonance can impact historical narratives, both as they're happening and as they're being revised in later years. Now, one other narrative that I would like to talk about here in relation to the Spanish conquest of the Aztec is the narrative that doesn't really look at things like morality and human psychology. It looks more at deterministic views of the world. And here I'm talking about Jared Diamond and his very famous book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. In the book, Jared Diamond basically argues for what we call geographic determinism. And there's a little more to it, but basically the idea is that because of where European and Asian civilizations developed, because of the types of domesticated animals and geographic environments that were found only in those areas, because of the way human migrations shaked out tens of thousands of years ago, certain things were just naturally present in European or Spanish civilization that were not there for the Aztecs, and this is the main factor that resulted in the conquest. And those main things are guns, which the Spanish had, but the Mexica did not. Germs, which the Europeans had been exposed to, in particular smallpox, so they were immune to it largely, while it completely wiped out the peoples of Mesoamerica, and steel weapons. So this is a deterministic view, again, meaning that the conquest of the Aztec Empire by the Spanish was mostly due to factors beyond the control, really, of either empire. This narrative is very popular in modern popular culture, but from a historian perspective, most historians nowadays do acknowledge that guns, germs, and steel played a major role in the story, but they don't ascribe all of the causality to those things, because in many ways it robs the human element of the story. It takes away the impact of people's choices. It makes it seem like the conquest was a foregone conclusion, which it wasn't necessarily. And it takes away the importance of some of the realities of political and social life in the Aztec Empire, which absolutely contributed in a huge way to this story. Historian Thomas J. Brinkerhoff, in his paper Re-examining the Lore of the Archetypal Conquistador, Hernán Cortés and the Spanish Conquest of the Aztec Empire, 1519 to 1521, he says, quote, "This sense of a natural European advantage is most notable in Jared Diamond's widely popular Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. Diamond's argument regarding the reasons behind Spanish victory, which can be found in the book's title, reduces the agency of all human actors, Spanish and indigenous alike, by analyzing the conquest solely through the lens of weaponry and disease. Although the Spanish did have superior military technology, it was by no means revolutionary. Additionally, the Spanish often borrowed from the Mexica concept of theatrical violence, public displays of brutality designed to frighten enemies into submission, as a way to avoid increased combat. As the Spanish cartographer and translator John Ogilby explained in 1670, the Spanish conquistadors practiced fear-conquering more than slaughter. With respect to the role of disease, Diamond is correct in his assertion that disease had a devastating impact on the indigenous inhabitants of the Aztec Empire. Still, the effect of disease in assuring Spanish victory was far more pronounced in the Incan Empire, where smallpox was ravaging that civilization as Francisco Pizarro defeated the Incan leader Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca in November 1532. When examined together, the sampling of scholarly and popular histories highlighted in this section ignore issues of the protracted nature of the conquest, the role of indigenous allies in assisting Spanish victory, and the disparate notions of war and society felt by the Spanish and the indigenous. End quote. So that was a long quote there, but what Brinkerhoff is saying here is that Guns, Germs, and Steel fails to account for large and important parts of this story that we've outlined in this podcast series. It doesn't account for Mexica victories, which did occur, most notably at La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, but other small victories as well. It doesn't account for the huge role that Tlaxcala played in the conquest, becoming an ally for the Spanish, and it's uncertain if the Spanish would have been able to complete the conquest without them. It doesn't account for the fact, which we'll talk about in the next episode, that it would take the Spanish centuries to subdue all of the outskirts of places, provinces on the far reaches of the Aztec Empire. It doesn't account for the political and social realities of what life was like in Tenochtitlan and how those might have impacted Moctezuma and other Aztec leaders' behavior. And it doesn't account for the enormous role that Malintzin played, getting certain city-states to help the Spanish, translating for Cortez when he needed translation, using language as a weapon to win hearts and minds. That was a deliberate choice made by Malintzin. And that choice may have been the result of choices made by leaders of the Aztec Empire and the people living in it. So overall, Guns, Germs, and Steel definitely has elements of truth in it, but it's not the whole story. And hopefully we can see how these historical narratives of the conquest have evolved over time and ultimately given way to a more modern approach at looking at the conflict that in many ways synthesizes a lot of these different narratives and approaches and combines them all together. Hopefully we can see that this was and is a historical tale of choice and chance, rise and fall, good and evil, the things that only humans are capable of. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes, Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.